Well, hello there. It's us from the introduction video. I'm Sara.
And I'm Reed, and we are going to be talking to you about Libya in this video. We're the two undergraduates, so we're going to be double teaming this one, so it's going to be double trouble.
Exactly. Now we're gonna do basis off two things. One, Gaddafi, the egalitarian rapist, kind of a paradox or an moron, if you ask me. And then the pro-regime woman versus the anti-regime woman. So Gaddafi, he's has a lot of nicknames, but here he is the king of kings. As a group, we thought it would be vital to specifically focus on Libya's Muammar Gaddafi. To say the very least, he's an eccentric and perhaps one of the most controversial figures in modern history. He was the dictator of Libya for 40 years. Now, American bias is very real. If you Google search Gaddafi in the scope of the Western world, you'll see him from a very biased lens. American media tends to use anti-socialist rhetoric. So in this portion, we will focus on the socialist good and positive aspects of Gaddafi, which is oftentimes overlooked and ignored. So to start with, he strategically overthrew the prior Libyan monarch. King Idris was in Greece, and in an organization he put together, he overthrew the prior regime, famously called a white revolution, because not a single shot was fired. In one day, yesterday, let's say it was a Libyan monarchy, today, because of him, it was a socialist republic with no violence. That's just amazing. He was able to boost the GDP by 600% because he nationalized all oil fields. Hence, profits from foreign oil companies were extracted. Could be why America wasn't his biggest fan at all. Libya's GDP rose from about 3.5 billion to 1969 to over 20 billion in 1979. That is just in 10 years, 600%. Let that set in. Now, he used the oil money to fund public works and education and redistributed wealth among the lower classes. This was awesome because King Idris did little to nothing to specifically educate women while Gaddafi did. And due to the desert climate, Gaddafi made what many believe as the eighth wonder in the world as he executed the largest irrigation project in the world. It was designed so all water could be accessed to all Libyans in a very deserted climate. Now, it's important to talk. This is a women's studies class that we are making the Zoom cast for, so we have to talk about the dynamic of women. So, let's introduce his bodyguards, who were all females and called Amazons, aka a team of virgins who pledged chastity and were trained in martial arts. The entourage are always with him. We're always with him at every time, every place. Apparently, his favorite posse member was a voluptuous blonde. Now, this is Aisha Gaddafi's, Muammar Gaddafi's only daughter, and she is better known as Libya's it girl or the Claudia Schiffer of Libya, which is Claudia Schiffer on the left. She was known for being admired and loved specifically by Western Libyans. Remember that because of her beauty, intellect, savviness, blondness, and designer clothes. Aisha is interesting because, from our understanding, it is theorized that only modern Muslims would idolize her. While most Libyan women admired her, the less Islamically religious and upper class ones tended to actually behave like her. There is an obvious contrast between the two classes of women, which is what we'll get into later during the Arab Spring. Now, we need to talk about Gaddafi's absolutely terrifying libido. Oh my God, it will give you goosebumps. And we also learned that he's a hypocrite. So leave it to Gaddafi to indulge in his libido. He has a signal for when he wanted to sleep with a woman he met in public. As she walked away, he would pat her on the shoulder, just like that. And as soon as he had passed, a member of his entourage would take the girl aside and, quotations, ask her back to Gaddafi's palace. When the woman he had chosen arrived at his private quarters, they found a mermaid crafted couch that looked a lot like his daughter. That was kind of weird. Visitors may have also set eyes on the world's largest golden gun collection and one of the world's best stocked cabinets of liquor, which was illegal everywhere else in Libya. And you know what was also illegal? Abortion. And to get away from that, Gaddafi built a large underground medical clinic where a full time medical staff would abort the many pregnancies for which he was responsible for. On average, it is said that he slept between 4 to 5 women a day. Slept with 4 to 5 women a day. That is pretty gross. So we ask ourselves, is Gaddafi bad or good? Well, just think about those women who he slept with 4 to 5 women a day. They probably didn't have a choice. He was probably a racist. He was a racist, actually. So holistically, a benevolent for Libya, but inexcusable and misogynist at the end of the day. And it's very important to note that. Now, Reed will talk about more about the Arab Spring now.
Yes. So, although the Arab Spring was occurring in other countries at the time, like Tunisia and Yemen and other countries, it wasn't until the arrest of Fadi Turbel. Fadi Turbel is a human rights activist and also a lawyer. He was responsible for the cases of nearly 1,000 dead inmates in the local prison system, which was highly controversial because a lot of the arrests and a lot of the targeted killings in these uh, prisons were racially motivated. And so, following his arrest, the citizens became very outraged, and race riots began to occur at the Benghazi police headquarters. About 500 to 600 people were there, and Gaddafi actually banned flights from going above. And he initially said this was to prevent any bombings or harm of citizens. However, it was actually because he was tear gassing, water cannoning, and the soldiers were throwing rocks at civilians that were protesting. And he was prohibiting flight because he didn't want any other countries to gain image of what was occurring. Throughout this race riot, many were injured, up to 38, I believe, and there was actually a few casualties. After that, the movement really began to gain traction, and this is when we actually see a revolution occur and the binding together of rebel troops. And you can go ahead and change slides.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So the liberation of Libya was primarily due to overthrow Gaddafi, because although, like you said, he had a lot of positives, he also had a lot of negatives. So when in the rebellion that began to form, we saw participation from people from all backgrounds, regardless of gender, sexuality, or socioeconomic status. And many were teachers, doctors, police officers, lawyers, and oil workers. And they began to primarily gain traction in East and Western Libya. And these were actually the territories that were first to fall. As Gaddafi began to lose the rebellion and more citizens began joining force, he began bombing innocent civilians and attacking and causing many casualties of war, which is really sad and made it a very unsafe place for his citizens throughout his demise. And if it hadn't been for the US involvement, the rebel troops might have actually not won the war because they were given weapons from and other resources from US troops.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately in September 2011, Gaddafi was actually executed after the capture of all of his loyalists.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, as I said before, there's a stark contrast between women who aspire to be like Aisha Gaddafi and women who don't. The contrast is also apparent when it came to Libya in the Arab Spring. In Western Libya, while women were largely absent from initial street protests that were suppressed by the regime, they have been conspicuous in more recent displays of loyalty to the brother leader, Gaddafi. Brother leader. The woman chanted, sang, and praised Gaddafi, as you can see in this photo with the posters and them chanting. And they were usually segregated from male supporters. I believe almost all protests were with women and children. At Gaddafi's Tripoli compound in February 2011, hundreds of female fans gathered late at night to act as human shields for Gaddafi. Many beautifully made up beneath their headscarves as if it was for a night out, which in a way it kind of was. But it's a different story elsewhere for women in Libya. They were more adamant. As Mervat El-Zouki, a Benghazi resident, said, men and women were all working for the same thing in the revolution. We want to be able to speak our minds, to be ourselves, to be Libyans. We want a happy ending, to get rid of this maniac family that controlled everything we did. Essentially, Aisha and Gaddafi. Women are not calling for their own rights, but those of everyone. It's very important, I think, and a very strong quote. In common with many Arab countries, middle class women in Libya tend to be highly educated and prevalent in professions such as medicine and law. But the poorer sisters are confined largely to the home and shadows of their menfolk. Also, majority of Sharia law supporters and religious Muslim women were anti-Gaddafi, which was basically elsewhere in Libya except Western Libya. So even some middle class women who did not follow Sharia law did understand the poorer sisters were not getting the best of the best with Gaddafi. So they all women essentially joined together to go against Gaddafi except the West. Now, I want to show you 5 seconds of this video as a primary source because this will show a video of women and children chanting against Gaddafi. This also reminds us of what we learned in Professor Ian's class of how intersectionality is shown in protest when he displayed his own primary pictures of the Women's March. Protesting was a beautiful way for women to chant, sing, and cry for their support of the revolution. Do you remember when Professor Barnard did that, Reed?
I do.
Yeah.
And he talked about how he used his own photos from the Women's March as a primary source in his literature.
And I think that sentiment showing how empowering protest can be is shown in this video. Now, I'm just going to skip to 8 seconds. So that's just 5 seconds, but as you can see, the woman did look quite liberated. If you want to watch the full video, you can. We will give you that information. 1 second. Awesome.
I think that video is such a great resource because I think it really demonstrates the woman's involvement and desire for political change in the country. Women's role in the rebellion was somewhat limited in the traditional sense that we didn't see them out fighting in the battles and whatnot because one, traditionally women aren't allowed to fight there, and two, it was relatively unsafe. And in Gaddafi's undoing, he would have done anything to hurt anyone, and women could have potentially been raped or decapitated or worse, tortured. And so women found other ways to get involved. And I think, like we said, one of the best ones was they participated in the daily protests and celebrations. And I think that this one reflected troops and encouragement for the support and encouragement for the troops. In addition to, I think it showed their perspective on their narration, that even though they are in this country, they don't necessarily agree with how their government is run. And I think that that, on a global sense, showed their views and narration. There's also a few other interesting ways that they were actually able to participate in the rebellion. And one of those was actually making food for the troops, which I thought was really interesting. But I guess in a struggling country where putting food, generating enough food for your own household was a struggle, they found ways to feed entire rebel fleets and for breakfast, for lunch, and for dinner, which I think is a huge undersold part of this narrative, that there is actually a lot of women working in the backdrop to make sure that supplies were being distributed and that soldiers were getting their basic needs met. And another example is women were often used as paramedics and actually treating the wounded that were drugged off from the battle. And that's another huge aspect that has failed to be recognized, I think. And the third, and really their involvement that I never really even would have imagined, was their economic involvement. Many women sold precious jewelry to them, and in order to buy guns, jeeps, and food and other resources necessary for the rebellion. The whole rebellion was from the people, and so everything from economic purposes to the people that were fighting in it were people that believed in political change. And I think women really acknowledged that and found ways to get involved and support in any way that they could.
That's an interesting sentiment because to make comparisons, like this is very how women acted in the Libyan war or Libyan revolution is very similar to how women acted, like as we learned in past in like school of how women acted during World War I, World War II in America. So that's a very common rhetoric that women display during war in a male dominant situation. But also, I had no idea because in Libya specifically, since it wasn't safe for women to always protest, even though that was our primary source, because eventually did have to be segregated, they were very resilient and showed other ways of showing their support through different rhetorics, which is really great. Thank you for telling us, Reed.
Hmm. So, following the liberation of Libya, the United Nations took legal representation of Libya for a while. The country did struggle to get their democracy established, and I believe it wasn't until 2015 that they held their first elections, and I believe they held another election in 2019. However, one positive that we can see is 33 women serve in Congress. And even though women didn't necessarily or have not yet gained major bounds forward in social or political change, what we can see is that Libya is no longer ran by a dictatorship. And even though Gaddafi did a lot of positives, as we previously discussed for this country, he was also oppressive and misogynistic towards women. And ultimately, even though he granted them some rights, he was still oppressing them in a lot of different ways and the people as a whole. And so I think that we can see that women wanted to move forward from that and have their own representation in the political system and be advocating for their own social, political, and economic rights, which we can now see here, which ultimately I think is amazing. And I think Libya will continue to progress as a country.
Yes, I hope so. They're not at the best state right now, but hopefully things will get better. Thank you so much. So, as we would say, shukran.
Shikran, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button.